All right, welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Remote Desktop Services Personal Virtual Desktops. And in this video, we're going to talk about the successor to the old Terminal Services. And by the way, if you start looking for Terminal Services stuff under the name Terminal Services, you're not going to find it. It's now Remote Desktop Services. It's all dancing, all singing. It's some pretty cool stuff. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at actually personal desktops utilizing Hyper-V. There's some really cool stuff in here. Now, if you're familiar with Citrix style environments, you're going to see some similarities to that kind of style. Everything that is old is new again, it seems like. We seem to be starting to move back towards this idea of the mainframe and dummy terminals. So kind of an interesting thing. So we're going to take a look at why we might want to implement this, and we're also going to talk about what is a VDI? And it sounds initially kind of sinister. But of course, you know, in computer world, we like that alphabet soup, and I'll tell you about what a VDI is. But of course, not before we get into looking at what does it look like to implement personal virtual desktop machines, Windows 7 clients to be exact, by the way, utilizing remote desktop services. So let's go ahead and let's get into it now. Here's the thing. I told you earlier that everything that's old is new again, and I'm not really kidding. in this kind of structure, what we're really going to be doing is actually utilizing virtual machines in order to provide remote desktops. We can manage those virtual machines on the server side. Our clients can access those virtual machines on their desktops, and there's a lot of great reasons to do this, by the way. Let's go ahead and talk about what actually happens with remote desktop services. First of all, of course, we have the RDS server, no big surprise there. The RDS server actually provides a connection from the Hyper-V server. On the Hyper-V server, we're going to have Windows 7 clients running on that particular machine. So we'll create a bunch of VMs, or maybe just one or two or three, or however many that you need. The remote desktop server will actually be providing access to our clients to those Hyper-V machines. Then what we're going to be able to do is we're actually going to paint the desktops onto our client machines, and they'll be able to, instead of using their desktop operating systems, they'll actually be accessing and doing everything on the virtual machines that we've set up over on the Hyper-V server. Now, the initial question I'm sure you're initially thinking is, why would you ever do this? Why is this a good idea? Well, we have some reduced hardware costs that we could actually start looking at. If you have a large amount of Windows XP desktops and you want to utilize Windows 7, but you don't have the hardware budget to upgrade all of your desktops to Windows 7 compliant hardware, well, here's the thing. You can actually use a Windows XP Service Pack 3 machine and install Remote Desktop Connection 7. You will be able to actually use your old hardware to run Windows 7, but you're not really running Windows 7 on that particular machine. You're actually running it over here on the Hyper-V server because we're actually accessing the virtual machine. So that's one reason. Another reason is going to be you can actually distribute your virtual personal desktops using web access. So your users can have extended access to all the resources on the client side on the corporate network as they would as if they were sitting there at their machine. So there's some advantages. Greater administrative control and security is probably one of the biggest. Already we see in highly secure environments, we see a lot of Citrix installations to provide that high level of security and control on our side in terms of the administrators. When you're accessing a virtual machine through remote desktop services, we can control what the user can do and can't do in a very granular fashion. We can do that anyway with group policy, right? But it's a lot harder to get around some of the, if there's a way to get around it, people will find it, right? And so we want to make sure that they can't. And in using this kind of remote desktop services personal desktop model, Yeah, it's a little easier. The last reason that I want to tell you is it's just cool. You know? I think it's just it's a very cool way to utilize already existing hardware. Not to mention the fact that for training environments, let's say you work in a training lab of some sort, maybe at a training center or at a corporate classroom, and you need to blow away or reset your images at the end of every day. Well, here's the beautiful thing. We can actually utilize snapshots. Ooh, isn't that neat? Already, I think you're already thinking, hey, if I want to reset a machine to whatever it was to an original state, it's super easy to do that with a snapshot, right? So that adds to the cool factor in terms of being able to distribute your virtual machines over remote desktop services. And again, don't forget that I mentioned to you earlier that you can use web access to distribute your virtual desktops to users wherever they may be if your users have external access to that, if that's in your DMZ. So now you kind of have the gist of what we're talking about, and I need to introduce to you a new acronym that relates to all of this, remote desktop, Hyper-V, hybrid kind of thing, where we're actually granting users access to desktops that are living on a Hyper-V machine. We use the term or the acronym VDI, and no, it's not a disease. It actually stands for Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. In all reality, we've been using virtual desktop infrastructures really since the day of dumb terminals, if you really want to stop and think about it. Not necessarily in the elegant way that we're able to do it now, but the concept is very similar. The actual information resides on the server. We're simply accessing it using a dumb terminal, or in our case, a remote desktop session. Now, of course, you're probably already thinking, hey, using remote desktop, we can also keep on track of who's connected, how long they're connected, all that good stuff as well. So there are a lot of advantages to deploying this kind of structure. Now, the question is, do you have the server hardware or the server hardware budget to implement this kind of thing? Now, if you want to distribute virtual machines to your entire company and you have 250 users, well, you're going to have to load up, that's for sure. But oftentimes, we may find ourselves only needing to provide access to this kind of thing, maybe to 3, 4, 5, 6 users at a time, and that's pretty easy to manage. We can do that with a standard Hyper-V class machine. And so that's going to be the kind of approach that I'm going to be taking to the next demonstration that I'm going to be moving you into. We're actually going to implement a basic VDI structure using remote desktop services and Hyper-V. So what I'm going to walk you through is actually how to implement and make this happen. And you're going to find out it's not that hard. There's a few complex little intricacies when we are configuring the virtual desktop machine in Hyper-V. And you know what? I happen to have a batch script for you. Oh, go figure, right? But I do have a batch script for you that's going to help you configure your personal desktop clients, these virtual machines you're going to be distributing to your users. It's pretty fast. It's pretty easy. But like I said, there are a few complexities. So let's go ahead and let's move on over to our server. We're going to start off by setting up our remote desktop services server. Our Hyper-V machine, well, it's already set, right? We've been using it this entire course, so we're just going to use the Hyper-V box that we do have. So we're going to bounce on over, install remote desktop services, start to get a foundation, and then work our way up. Alright, so here we are over on the Hyper-V machine. You see that I have a remote desktop virtual machine set up already. So we're going to go ahead and bring this guy up. This is just a blank vanilla server. All I've really done to it is I've given it a name and done the basic configurations, IP address, time zone, all that good stuff. I haven't installed any roles on it at all. So we're going to be installing remote desktop services. And again, if remote desktop services is kind of throwing you off, don't let it, because what it really is terminal services. And it has a new name because it has new capabilities. That's pretty much the game. I think, remote desktop services has a little less dreadful tone to it than terminal services. I think terminal, I'm thinking, something bad. So I much prefer this new title just for the niceness, the way it sounds. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and add in this remote desktop services role, and there's several role services that we're going to need to also add in here. And so we're going to go ahead and just tell this guy next, and we're going to be implementing the session host. We're not going to be implementing the virtualization host. This particular role service we're going to install on the Hyper-V server so that we can utilize it at its virtual machines. Okay, so that's what this guy is for. It's not for your RDS server that's going to be providing connection. All right, so here's what I want you to remember about this first server we're configuring. This guy is going to be providing basically connection services to the Hyper-V machine. So it's going to be the go-between, the middle manager, if you will, between our users and the Hyper-V box. All right, desktop licensing. Now, normally you would install this, but I don't actually have licenses. And if you don't install this, we can use the 120-day trial license setup. So we're going to go ahead and do that for the terms of this particular demonstration. But just so you know, if you are going to be implementing this kind of thing, you're going to have to talk to your Microsoft representative and get your licensing and all that stuff lined out so that everything is in order. And by the way, Microsoft has introduced a new licensing structure with R2 called the VDI licensing. So there's actually a virtual desktop infrastructure licensing scheme that they have implemented. And I probably shouldn't use the word scheme. I should use the word setup or whatever. But anyway, you are going to have to wrestle that down with those guys, just so you know. But if you're just playing along at home and you're doing some initial testing, don't install the licensing server because you won't need it. We can always use the 120-day version for it. We do want the desktop connection broker, though. That's a good idea. And the remote desktop gateway, which is going to require us to install IIS. No problem. And also, I like this whole remote desktop web access idea. I'm sure you've seen it before, so we're going to go ahead and install that guy as well, and we'll tell it next. Now, you already know from seeing previous videos probably, or your previous experience, that when you're utilizing remote desktop, there's a lot of screens to walk through, right? So we're going to be walking through each one of these screens just like we would as we were installing it. Now, this initial warning is telling me that, hey, if you already have applications installed, that you might need to reinstall them. Well, we don't have any applications installed. We're just going to tell it next. All right, the next option is what level of authentication is required. Well, we usually select required network level authentication. We want to make sure that our users are authenticated against Active Directory, if nothing else, to make sure that they can actually connect. All right, so we'll tell it next. I know, nothing surprising later. The remote desktop licensing mode, we're going to leave that blank so we can use basically the trial version of it for the next 120 days or the next 120 minutes, whichever comes first, right? So we'll configure that later. We'll tell it next. And now we need to make sure to add the users or user groups that can connect to this remote desktop session host server. Let's go ahead and we're going to add in a group that I've actually already created. It's called Seattle. We're going to use the Seattle user groups so that anyone in that one particular group can have access to this particular server. All right, we'll tell it OK. And of course, you want to leave your administrators in there. No big surprise, right? We're going to tell it next. And now, client experience. The question of what you want to select here in client experience is going to be based upon A, what you want your users to be able to do. If you want them to have a very full Windows 7 experience, you'll check all three of these guys here. Audio and video playback, audio recording redirection, that allows you to actually utilize a microphone and record on the actual virtual machine using remote desktop. So you're actually pushing your voice through whatever network you are using, either the internet or a LAN, and they can actually record on the VM. So kind of nifty. And the last one here is if you want your users to have access to Windows Aero, you can select this. Now, some people think, hey, yeah, I really want to do that. Some people are like, yeah, that's a waste of bandwidth. It's a waste of processor time. I don't like it. I like it, and I do use it when I'm not doing anything like extravagantly technical. But for the average corporate user, they're probably not going to need that. And it's kind of nice, it's pretty, but so you're going to have to make a call on that. Just do remember that anything you check does increase your bandwidth requirements. So keep that in mind as you are looking at these options. I'm going to go ahead and leave audio and video playback and desktop composition selected for the time being, and we'll go ahead and we'll tell it next. On the next screen, this is where we get to decide how we're going to encrypt our connections. And do you want to encrypt? Yes, you do. For this example session, I'm going to use a self-signed certificate for SSL encryption. I don't actually have a certificate authority up and running right now, so I'm going to skip that. If I were in a corporate production environment, I would go ahead and utilize some kind of either an internal CA certificate or a third-party certificate if I had one available to me. Now, this third option, choose a certificate for SSL encryption later. Well, if you plan on importing a certificate later on, you could select this. However, you will notice here that for the remote desktop gateway to function, you must configure the server with a valid certificate. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're just going to use a self-signed one. It'll be fine. And we'll tell it next. All right, now how about connection authorization policies? Now we've configured the session host, right? So we've decided who can connect to the session host. Now we want to decide who can connect to the gateway server. So we've done the session host thing. We're going to do the gateway thing. So let's go ahead and we're going to create an authorization policy now. We're going to decide which users can connect through the gateway server here. So we're going to use Seattle again. No big surprise there. And we'll tell it next. And of course you would select, and add in anybody else that you wanted to have access to it. Now we're going to give it a name. And also you can decide if you want to utilize passwords or smart cards. So if you're implementing smart cards in your network, either now or later, you could actually put a check mark in that or enable that later on. So just so you know, whenever you're modifying these initial installation policies, you can always go back and make modifications later on, right? All right, so we're going to tell it next. And now we're going to create our resource authorization policy to specify the network resources that users can connect to through this remote desktop. So we would, at this point in time, create a name. You notice that I'm just leaving the defaults as they are. I don't see any reason to change those. But now we need to decide which computers are we going to allow access to. Now we can specify a group of computers, or we can allow users to connect to any computer on the network. Most of the time, especially in the whole personal virtual desktop philosophy, we would actually specify a specific group of computers. I don't have a group of computers set up right now, so I'm going to go ahead and put a check mark here and allow users to connect to any computer on the network. But if I was doing this in a production level environment, I would go ahead and create that group in Active Directory and specify that group here. But since this is a demonstration, let's just go ahead and make this as easy as possible on us. We'll tell it next. And now we're into the whole network policy and access services. Now you're going to have to install this, but you don't have to configure the whole health certificates and all of that good stuff that goes along with it if you don't want to. You probably should, just so you know. You don't want your rogue machines accessing your corporate network if they don't have the prerequisite patches and all that good stuff installed on them. But normally, if you would use that, you would probably have a separate server that would handle that anyway, right? So we're going to go ahead and leave the default selected, and we're going to skip the rest of the routing remote access services, health registration authority, host credential authorization. We're going to skip all that and tell it next. Now we need to install the IIS stuff, so we'll tell it next. And here is a listing of what it's going to install for us. That's going to be fine. I don't need to make any changes to that. We'll tell it next. And now it's going to tell us, okay, here's all the stuff that you're doing. It all looks great. Thank you, wizard. Let's tell it to install. And now let's go drink a cup of coffee, all right? So I'm going to be back with you as soon as this guy finishes installation, and I'll take you into the next steps. Alright, so you see that it's installed, but looks like I do need to restart the server, so I'm going to go ahead and close that guy. And we're going to go ahead and restart. And while we're restarting, I think what we'll do to maximize our time is we're going to go over here to our Hyper-V server. Now that our remote desktop services server is starting to get in line with the program here, let's go ahead and let's install our remote desktop virtualization host, because this guy is going to be providing the virtual machines for our users to connect to, right? So let's go ahead and tell it next. And let's see here, remote desktop services. We'll put a check mark in that guy. We'll tell him next. And we'll tell him next. And we'll put a check mark only in the remote desktop virtualization host for this particular server, because we don't want him to do anything else, right? We just want it to hum along and provide our users with virtual machines. So we're going to go ahead and put a check mark in that guy, tell it next, and install. And this shouldn't take very long, and we shouldn't require a restart for this one because it's not as intensive as all the modifications that we made earlier. All right, looks like we're good there. We'll tell it to close. And now we'll go back on over to our R2 remote desktop. Nope, he's not quite done rebooting. So as soon as he does, then I'll be right back. Alright, there we go. We got that guy restarted. And just so you know, I did go ahead and log in with the SuperCoach Enterprise login. And you see we have all kinds of little warning messages all over through this screen. And some of these things we need to concern ourselves with. Some of them we do not. But we do know that we did get these guys installed successfully. But remote desktop services is going to require some additional configuration. Now, one thing I want to point out here too, here it says enable Windows 7 features on this RD session host by using desktop experience. Well, just so you know, let's go ahead and close this guy here real quick. If I go into features, let's see if in features, yeah, desktop experience, looks like somewhere along the line I installed that. I don't know how, don't know where, but in case you don't know how to install that, you just go to features. And you put a check mark in desktop experience and hit next and install. It's not hard, but just want to show you that somewhere along the line. I'm not sure where, but I did install that. All right, so we have our foundations laid now for our personal virtual desktop. Let's go into remote desktop services because, like I said, we are going to have to do some additional configuration for RDS to be able to provide access to those remote desktops. And we'll go ahead and expand this guy. And we'll go to the remote app manager and we'll take a look. Normally this is this is kind of our one-stop shop for most of the work that we would do, but there's a lot more stuff that we need to get done first before we come in here and wrestle some of these configuration items. So now that we have our foundation laid, now let's go ahead and turn our attention over to our client machine that we're going to be making available to a particular user. Now the goal of having a personal virtual desktop is that only one user can actually use it. Right? So that's going to be our point of success. That's our standard that we're working towards. I did turn off my second client because I only have 4 gigs of RAM on this particular machine. And I wanted to boost up this particular machine as high as I could get it. So I added the extra, half a gig of RAM over here. So we're actually running a full gig on this win7.globalmanticsr2.com. Oh yeah, one more thing. Notice how I named this particular machine with its fully qualified domain name. Okay, that's going to be critical when we go to actually make this guy available to our external users. So let's go ahead and let's move on over here to him. Now what we need to do with this guy, first of all, let me just show you where I'm logged in at. I'm actually logged in here as SuperCoach. So if you're playing along home, you can log in as your enterprise administrator to make this super duper easy. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull up a little batch script that is going to actually help prep this machine for actual use in a VDI environment. So we're going to open up ISO, and you notice here that I placed my RDP protocols on this particular folder share. There's 1,000 ways you can get folder or files or batch files onto your machine. You're advanced enough that you know that you would select the best way to do it. I just happen to do shares early and often because it's just hedonistically easy, okay? All right, I'm going to copy that particular file, RDP protocols, and put it over here onto the C drive so I can get to it super fast, super easy. And now we're going to, before we run that file, let's go ahead and let's turn on the ability for remote desktop in this particular machine. So we'll right-click on computer and go to its properties, and we'll go to remote settings. Imagine that, right? Now, right now, we're not allowing any remote desktop connections to this machine. No, that's not so good. We want to make sure we are allowing connections only from computers running remote desktop with network level authentication, as it is more secure. That'll be good. And we'll go ahead and we'll tell it OK. That's as much as we need to do for right now. Let's go ahead and let's run that batch script next. Now what this batch script is going to do, actually, let's go ahead before we do that. Let's go ahead and take a look at this bad boy here. Right click and edit him. Let me go ahead and show you what I've done and what I've built for you in this particular batch script. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm enabling the remote desktop protocols that we're going to need, and also making sure that we are providing access for and through this particular Hyper-V machine. So you notice here that I have the name of my Hyper-V machine hanging out right here inside of these quotes, ending with a $sign. So when you're using this script, all you'll need to do is put in the name of your Hyper-V machine that you're wanting to provide access with. So, and notice here that it's the same thing through these other 3 lines. And then we stop the term service, and then we start the term service. It's not a really elaborate script, but there's enough stuff in this script, as you can see, that why not just run it as a batch script, right? I could teach you how to type all this stuff out, making sure that the RDP, TCP, terminal protocols are enabled. But you know what? Let's just go ahead and run it as a batch script. Let's make it easy. All right, so. And again, this batch script is included with the course. Let's go ahead and open up CMD, but we're going to make sure we run this as an administrator. If we don't, it's going to be angry, okay? So we're going to run CMD as administrator by right-clicking and selecting Run as Administrator. And now let's go ahead and go over to our batch script locale here, which is on the D drive or the C drive. And now I'm just going to go ahead and run it. RDP protocols .bat. Ta-da! All right, and it runs, and it's going to ask me, hey, the following services are dependent on the remote desktop service. Stopping the remote desktop services will also stop these services. Yada yada. Yes, that's fine. We're making the modification, and nobody is currently connected to this machine, so we're going to go ahead and make that happen. And it's going to basically just restart our remote desktop services service. That's it. So enabling the remote desktop protocols that we need, those are not enabled, by the way, when you simply turn on remote desktop. We have to do additional stuff. And I've tried to make this as easy as possible so that you can, with this batch script, so you don't have to learn a billion commands for it. All right, so we've got that far. We're in good shape. Let's move on to the next step, which we do need to go into the registry. All right, so I know that that's a little scary for some people, and I want you to not be that scared of the registry. So just go to your start menu in your search and type regedit like you normally would to go into the registry. Now, by the way, if we're doing this for a lot of virtual machines, we can use group policy preferences to set this registry setting, by the way. Wanted to mention that to you, but since I'm only doing one machine for demo, I want to show you where this registry setting actually is, and also help you conquer your fear of the registry if you have one. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to be enabling basically the RPC remote, or remote RPC, if you will. And it's not that hard to get to. We're going to go into HKey local machine here. We're going to go into System. We're going to go into the current control set. We're going to go into Control. And I'm going to scroll over here so we can see all of them. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to find Terminal Server. And I know initially you're thinking, hey, why is it still called Terminal Server? I don't know. Everything's called Remote Desktop Services now, and Microsoft's making a big deal out of it. Now we go into the registry, and we're still seeing Terminal Server. I'm guessing it's probably for a backwards compatibility thing in case someone is using Server 2008 or even Server 2000 or 2003. So go ahead and we'll click right on here onto terminal server, and we're going to find the allow remote RPC value. Let's go ahead and double click on that guy. Notice that he's currently set to 0. Well, if we would attempt to access this guy using our VDI infrastructure, it's not going to work because we need the remote procedure call to be remoted. So let's go ahead and let's type a 1 in the box. And now we are now allowing for that remote RPC item. We need to get into the firewall, and we'll need to make a quick exception to that guy. And again, that's another thing that you can actually set up inside of group policy and preferences and whatnot. We're only setting up one machine, so we're just going to go ahead and do this manually so that you know which setting you actually do need to alter. What we need to do is we need to allow a particular program through the firewall. So we're going to go here to allow a program or feature through Windows Firewall. And scroll down. We need to find Remote Service Management. Let's go ahead and put a check mark for this guy. This is going to allow the Remote Service Management to get through the firewall so we can actually have control over this machine via the remote desktop server that we've been working on setting up. Now you'll see that domain is initially checked. That's what we need to do, but we don't need to check home and work or public because this particular machine is only actually going to be living and working inside of the domain, even though we're going to be accessing it through remote desktop protocol from probably outside of the home office, or even if we are working on inside of our network borders, we're still going to be A-OK. So we're good for that. We'll tell that one OK, and we're good. So that's pretty much all we need to do for that guy. So our virtual personal desktop is now ready. Let's go ahead and let's log off for our primary user here that we used to configure the machine. We'll go ahead and we'll log that one off, and this way we'll be able to log on to it using a user account. I think we'll probably use Gmoney. We've kind of been using that user account here early and often, and I think it's a fun account. So we're going to go ahead and we'll use our Gmoney account to actually access our virtual machine. But now in order to do that, let's go ahead and let's go back to remote desktop because we haven't quite finished working on this guy. All right, so let's take a look at the next steps that we need for setting up the remote desktop services for this one. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and move over to the remote desktop connection manager, and let's start working here. First of all, anything you see with the big red X, that's usually a bad thing. First of all, our remote desktop connection broker is not configured for use for personal desktops. So let's go ahead and let's configure that guy here real quick. So when we're configuring our connection broker here, we're going to go ahead and add in our virtualization host. Now, of course, you and I both know that our virtualization host is called Hyper-V. That's the one we just added the virtualization host role service to, right? So we're going ahead and we'll add him, and there he is. You notice that I just used the NetBIOS name. You could use the fully qualified domain name to find it as well. We'll tell it next. What we need to do now is we need to specify the remote desktop session host server in what we call redirection mode. What we want to do is we want to redirect the remote desktop request over to the session host server. So we need to be able to do that. And of course, the remote desktop session host, it can be a separate machine. In ours, however, our session host is on the same machine. So we're going to go ahead and simply put in this machine's address, which is, of course, R2 remote desktop. Now, this RDC version support, if you need to provide redirection for clients using remote desktop connection RDC 6.1 or earlier, you need to provide an alternative server name. Well, here's the thing. If we want to be using any of the more advanced remote desktop features like Windows Aero or multiple monitor support or any of the multimedia stuff, that you got to use RDC7. Okay, you just can't get around it. So we're not going to mess with that. In this automatic configuration, the only option here is if we do not want to automatically configure R2 remote desktop for redirection, and that's not what we want. We don't want to mess with that. Let's just go ahead and skip that. We'll tell it next. And it's going to sit here and spin for just a little bit. What's going to be coming up next here is we need to specify an RD web access server. Now, probably in a production environment, the web access server is probably going to be a separate box. Now, in our case, it's not. We're putting everything on this one virtual machine, which is fine for a testing environment to learn how to make all this stuff happen, right? But in a production environment, we would probably be specifying a different server name here, but we're going to go ahead and just use R2 Remote Desktop because that is our RD Web Access Server as well. And we'll hit Enter, and now it's going to make sure that we're actually able to connect and talk to Hyper-V. We'll tell it to apply, and let's see if we get a success message here. Beautiful. All right, so we were successful in setting up our remote desktop connection server role for using those personal virtual desktops. All right, now we could assign a personal virtual desktop right now. Sure, why not? Let's go ahead and let's do that. Let's hit Finish. And we're going to go ahead and let's assign G-Money to our machine that we just set up. Now, of course, there's still more stuff we need to do, all right, just so you know. But since we're at this point, let's go ahead and just assign G-Money the Windows 7 client machine here. And notice here that I did name it. I named the virtual machine the same thing as its fully qualified domain name. That's critical. If you don't do that, it's going to be angry, all right? We'll tell it next. You specify the following assignment. G-Money is assigned to win7.globalmanticsr2.com. Neato. We'll hit Assign, and we will, let's uncheck this, assign another virtual machine to another user, because this is the only one we're going to assign in our test run here. We'll hit Finish. So the connection broker is now configured for personal virtual desktops. That's a fantastic thing. Let's move on to the next step now. What we're going to do is we're now going to add a source, which is going to be, we're going to add or configure a source for our, basically the source of our personal desktops. So let's go ahead and we're going to go here to the Start menu. We're going to go to Administrative Tools and Remote Desktop Services, and we're going to go to Remote Desktop Web Access Configuration. Now this is actually going to take us to a web page interface this time around. So we're going to be moving out of the Server Manager briefly and getting into a web-based administration screen here. And it's going to tell me that there's a problem with the certificate. That's because, remember that I told it to use a self-signed certificate, right? So it's going to be a little angry about that, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and continue to this website. That's fine. Notice that we are connecting via HTTPS. We're going to localhost RD web pages, default ASPX, and then a little, there we go. Okay. So now we're going to the login page, and we're going to go ahead and log in now as the GlobalMantics R2 administrator. So let's go ahead and do that. Making sure that I can type. Okay, there we go. GlobalMantics R2 / Supercoach. And we're going to go ahead and just log in here real quick. And we can log in either as a public or private computer. And since I'm on the machine, I'll go ahead and specify private computer. It'll be fine. And sign in. Now, if you'll read the text here, you must configure RD Web Access to provide users access to remote app and desktop connection. Use these settings to specify the source that provides the remote app programs and desktops that are displayed to users through remote app and desktop connection. Users can access remote app and desktop connection through the Start menu on a computer that's running Windows 7 or through the RD Web Access website. And of course, that's the site that we're on right now, right? But since we're logged in as the administrator, it immediately dumps us to the configuration page because, well, this hasn't been configured yet. So here's what we're going to do to provide the source of the connections for our remote desktops. That's what we're doing here. We're going to be specifying the RD connection broker server. Now, of course, if this is a separate server, then we would specify it, but this is still the same server because we're doing everything on one box, right? Literally on one virtual box. So we're going to do R2 remote desktop .globalmanticsr2.com, and we'll go ahead and we'll tell it OK. And it dumps us to the blank page because we have no remote app programs configured. Let's go to remote desktop. And here, this is what the screen will look like, by the way, for your users when they go to the web page in order to access a personal virtual desktop via the remote desktop options here in web access. So kind of cool. We're not going to access one now because accessing it with the administrator account doesn't really prove anything. So what we want to do, let's go ahead and close this window, is we want to prove that only one user, G-Money, can access that one personal desktop that we've configured. Now, by the way, if you're not sure if you want to go back and figure out what the website actually is for your remote desktop or your remote app server, you just go into IIS real quick. And since we haven't created any other websites on this machine, this is going to be pretty easy. We'll just go here into default website. This is the subdirectory that we are utilizing for our remote desktop stuff. So it's going to be http:// and since we're looking at this from an internal standpoint, initially we would type in R2 remote desktop /RD web. And that's exactly what we would do. So if you want to actually browse the site here, which we can do that here, let's go ahead and browse it via HTTPS real quick. And again, we get the, there's a problem with the website security certificate. Yeah. That's fine. And now from here, our users would actually log in. Okay, so now that we have all of that configured, you know what the website actually is now. Let's go ahead and close out of the IIS manager. We're good for that. And there's one more thing that we need to check. Let's go to the configuration section here of the server manager. We'll go into the local users and groups and into groups. Let's take a look at the web access computers. We need to make sure that R2 remote desktop is a member of that, obviously, yes. So we're good for that. Just want to make sure that you know where this is real quick. So we're going to go ahead and leave this guy open for just a little bit while we do our initial testing, because I think we're ready. We've done a lot of work here. We have wrestled this guy down to the ground. Let's go ahead and minimize our remote desktop machine. And I think right here on Hyper-V Globo, let's go ahead and let's open up an Internet Explorer here real quick. And let's just go ahead and go to the website, http:// R2 remote desktop /RD web. And let's see if we can actually get to this site initially. And there we go. Of course, we're getting that. There's a problem with this website's security certificate. Yeah. Continue on. And now, let's go ahead and let's try to log in as G-Money. All right, so we'll do globalmantics R2 /G-Money. And we'll put in G-Money's password here. Let's go ahead and we'll do this as a public or shared computer as a test. We'll sign in. All right, and look, here is a My Desktop here for G-Money. Okay, let's go ahead and click on My Desktop, and it's going to give us a little bit of a warning. It's an unknown publisher, whatever. All right, and let's see here. Let's go ahead and let's put in G-Money's account credentials again here. And we'll see if we can get to that Windows 7 machine that we have set up. And the connection was denied because the user account is not authorized for remote login. Okay, well, let's go over to our virtual machines then. Let's go over to our Win 7 client, because I think I know what the problem is here actually. Let's go ahead and do a Control-Alt-Delete. This one should be pretty easy to fix. We need to add in Gmoney to the remote desktop users machine, or the group. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we're going to right click on computer and go to manage. And we'll go into local users and groups. And we'll go into groups. And let's go into remote desktop users here. And notice that we don't have anybody in remote desktop users. So we need to go ahead and add in Gmoney into our remote desktop users group here. Tell that OK and OK. And now let's go back and let's try it again. Let's go ahead and minimize our, we should probably log off of our virtual machine here as well, since I've been using the SuperCoach account. And let's go ahead and let's go back over here and let's try it one more time. Go to My Desktop and we'll connect. And we'll put in Gmoney's accounts here. And we'll try this one more time. I think that should fix our issue with that particular item. And there we go. There we have it. We're logging into our Windows 7 virtual machine from the web page. Pretty neat, huh? And imagine if you have a user that's running around the countryside and you want to provide them a secure connection back into your corporate network, and you want to provide them with secure access as you possibly can using a remote desktop. This is the way to go. Of course, we would need to publish out our remote desktop web access server. And by the way, if you're going to do that in production, you really should separate out the web access component from everything else. I know we've done everything here on one particular machine, and we did that just simply for convenience, and we didn't have that much RAM to play with on our Hyper-V machine. So we got the job done with only one server. If you're doing this internally, you could probably get away with one server. That'd be fine. But if you're going to be distributing and rolling this out enterprise-wide with a large amount of virtual machines and a large amount of users, obviously you're going to want to have multiple servers handling all of this kind of work. All right, probably even taking it so far as to build a server farm for some of these components. But you do see that it works. You've seen how it works. You notice that there's a lot of configuration. And so, and just so you know, I have provided a punch list for this particular section. So don't worry if you don't remember all the steps. I have created that punch list for you, and you'll find that in the same place where you find the scripts. Okay. All right. Well, that wraps this one up. We have successfully logged in using our personal virtual desktop. Oh, you know what? Let's try one more thing before we leave. Just for kicks, let's see what would happen if we logged in as Roger You There. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's sign out. And let's go ahead and let's see what would happen. Now, Roger You There has not been granted access, right? We haven't given Roger You There any kind of personal desktop or anything. So let's go ahead and let's just see what happens when we do actually log in as Roger You There into our remote access here. And what do we see? There's no My Desktop there, right? Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Let's go over to remote desktop. We could try to connect to another machine, but it's not in remote app programs for us, is it? So if Roger did want to try to get into a machine, he could. However, here's the thing. Roger would have his account would have to be added into one of the other machines' remote desktop users account. All right, so and that remote desktop user machine, would probably not be accessible from here. All right, so I think we have a success, right? We were trying to make sure that only Gmoney could have access to that one particular virtual machine. We were successful, and I think that you should pat yourself on the back for hanging with me through all that configuration, because I know there's a lot to it. So let's go ahead and bounce back on over to the slides and let's wrap this one up. Alright, so after watching this video, you should be able to define what a VDI actually is. Remember, it's Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. It's the ability to access virtual machines on a Hyper-V server. We use them as our personal desktops. It's pretty cool stuff. You should be able to install all the necessary roles and role services required for initial VDI. Remember that we need some of those roles on our Remote Desktop Services server that's going to be acting as our go-between between the Hyper-V machine and our users, right? Don't forget that you need to also install on the Hyper-V box the Remote Desktop Virtualization host. That's absolutely critical. You should also be able to name your Windows 7 virtual machines for use in the VDI. And remember, that's really super easy. All you have to do when you create the virtual machine is simply name that virtual machine with the fully qualified domain name of that machine. Right? So it's not rocket science. You just got to remember to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to assign any virtual desktops to any users. You should also be able to assign a user to a remote desktop or to a personal desktop. That was super easy, we found. And also use remote desktop web access to access a personal desktop virtual machine. Now, by the way, your user could also access that that personal virtual desktop using remote desktop connection software too. And I probably should mention to you as well that if you are going to work with this in Windows XP, I mentioned this to you before, but I want you to remember this. You must have Windows XP Service Pack 3 and the Remote Desktop Connection 7 software installed, even if you want to use web access. Now, web access is cool, right? It's super easy, but it utilizes the underlying Remote Desktop 7 connection software to actually make all that happen. Now, we were accessing that virtual machine using Windows Server 2008 R2, so we didn't have any problem with that, right? So that was a piece of cake. But if you are going to be, trying to save money on hardware using older Windows XP machines, you have to do those upgrades. All right, well, that wraps up this video. I'll see you in the next one.